I am back to talk to you about how it is that we're understanding Manuel Velasquez's chapter is Reason the Source of Our Knowledge. So again, this is a point in which we're understanding things epistemologically. So with philosophy, when we're understanding things by way of epistemology, we're then investigating how it is that we're understanding our knowledge. In other words, epistemology has to do with a philosophical investigation in terms of knowledge. So we're continuing through this journey into epistemology by way of understanding reason. And so for a rationalist, we must first make the distinction that reason is to be distinguished from perception. So when we're understanding things perceptually, we are understanding things by way of our senses, of sight, hearing, touch, smelling, etc. So the rationalists believe that perception is unreliable and that the way in which we're understanding things reasonably is what we should be relying on in terms of how it is that we're understanding things like mathematics. So Velasquez draws on the importance of the mathematician and the rationalist in terms of the idea that the mathematician and the logician, and by way also the rationalist philosopher, are working through the way in which they're understanding the world and knowledge at large by way of accurately describing the structure of how it is that we understand the world by way of reason. So in other words, we could describe the vast reaches of the universe by way of simply using our reasoning mathematically, scientifically, philosophically, so on and so forth. So this is where we encounter the term a priori knowledge. So a priori knowledge is otherwise known as knowledge that is known independently of perception and that which is necessarily true and indubitable. So when we reference that which is a priori, we're looking at pure reasoning, but the term itself also means prior to experience. So in other words, when I'm understanding something reasonably, I'm understanding it apart from the way in which I am perceiving things. And so Velasquez mentions the fact that the mathematician is behind the discoveries in astronomy in terms of how it is that we know about things like black holes, and there is the way in which we're understanding things mathematically that is accessed by way of our understanding of physics, for example, and by extension, the probabilistic outcomes of fields like quantum physics. The laws of logic are also of special interest in light of our a priori reasoning. So in other words, when we're using our logic in a strict sense, we are making use of our a priori reasoning. So such rules as at least one of any two contradictory propositions must be false. In other words, the principle of non-contradiction, the PNC, or no proposition can both be true and not true at the same time is also the principle of non-contradiction. So whereby these ideas are ways in which we are thinking of things as necessary and non-contradictory, and they're also fundamental to the way in which we understand knowledge itself. And so we looked at that earlier in terms of how it is that we're understanding metaphysics, and we're seeing that when we implement the law of non-contradiction, we are also understanding things in terms of what is the case and likewise how something is not the case. So it's inherently metaphysical, but also we're understanding that metaphysics is also the foundation for how it is that we're understanding things rationally. So they're overlapping. So our rational cognition of the world overlaps with our metaphysical understanding of the world as well. And so one point of confusion rests in the use and disuse of perception. So in other words, perception is not only ignored for the rationalist. The point is that it's not the only way in which we acquire knowledge for the rationalist. In other words, the answer is yes, we perceive things, but the way in which we perceive things is not the only way in which we make sense of the world and likewise order the world, because that ordering is a structure for the rationalists by which we are understanding things, getting to advances of mathematics, science, so on and so forth, philosophy. So reason for the rationalist is not known by way of perception, but by way of an operation of the mind as a structure or organization of all other thinking, including perception. So in other words, for the rationalist, perception is guided by our reasoning as well. And so there are other laws in terms of the laws of logic, and yet before we quote these, let's at least consider the word law in relation to reason and rational cognition. So a quick Google search shows that laws are understood as a system of rules observed or not under the penalty of the law. But that's not as specific as we want it to be. What we also are looking at is that which is regarded as having a binding force or effect of a formed system of rules. So in other words, reasoning is structural, and likewise the way in which we're understanding laws, regulations, guidelines, so on and so forth. So sometimes a law is an observed fact, such as the second law of thermodynamics, in that the entropy of any isolated system always increases. So in other words, oftentimes when we think of entropy, we're thinking about the way in which the universe is tending toward a state of entropy as opposed to the other direction. So in other words, entropy always increases. And so that's also reasonable for us to understand. And so just always see the words laws, rules, guidelines as having a necessary component of reason. And so not only do we see these as indications of the way in which our thinking is organized, to be in accordance with how it is that we operate in the world. So reason itself is an organizational principle. And so we have a few laws or law-like ways in which we understand things epistemologically. So for example, and metaphysically and rationally. So for example, every event has a cause. In other words, the law of causation is a way in which we're understanding things rationally. And then also the shortest distance between any 2 points on a surface is a straight line, is also geometric, mathematical, but simultaneously having to do with rational cognition. The universe follows the same law in all of its parts. And then also the processes of the universe, so this is another rewording of the same law. The processes of the universe are regular and can be explained in terms of consistent laws. So to be sure, these are organizational parts of our thinking, as I keep repeating, and these laws, rules, and guidelines are ways in which we rationally take into account reason's place in our knowledge of the world. And so, interestingly enough, Velasquez highlights a point of wisdom by way of the great Indian philosopher Shankara, who was born in 788 AD and dies in 822 AD, who is said to found a school of philosophy with affiliations to Hindu philosophy in relation to the term Brahman, otherwise known as ultimate reality. So Brahman for Shankara is otherwise known as ultimate reality. And so for Shankara, we also have the concept of sublation, which is tied to the idea that sublation, as Velasquez writes, is the process of correcting an error, which correcting an error about reality when it is contradicted by a different but more correct understanding of reality. So in other words, we are working with sublation in order to understand reality, and then simultaneously understanding how it is that we are negating things in order to get a deeper understanding of what Brahman is, the ultimate reality. So the way to get to ultimate reality is by trial and error, and likewise understanding that as sublation. And so sublation then is a way to clarify the delusions of perception. In other words, we have a reliance, a mere reliance on mere perception is susceptible to delusions as well. So again, perception is not necessarily to be trusted in this case because Shankara was inherently a rationalist, at least the way we look at it here in the West. And then so this delusion is a way in which we are deluded to the ultimate reality of the universe, otherwise known as Brahman. And so what's key here is the way in which we access knowledge of ourself, and self for Shankara is otherwise understood as Atman. And this is our Atman, or our true self, is fused and actually no different than Brahman. And so this is rather curious because the way in which we understand reason is, as I keep saying, organizational, but I think I mentioned earlier too that the way in which we understand reason, oddly enough, is also communal. So in other words, it's a way in which we communicate with others and likewise understand the larger whole. And so this way in which we understand the larger whole is something that we all share. So it's not just having to do with how I myself understand something, but also how it is that I understand the larger order of the universe, and likewise how it is that other people are understanding things in terms of Brahman, the ultimate reality, which is remarkably close to what we're looking at here in terms of reason and rational cognition itself. And so such a reference to this term, sublation, is remarkably close to the essential contradictions of the Socratic method. Just noticed that this light went off, but I think we'll just keep rolling here. And so we could also see this as related to the Socratic method, or what we call the dialectic. And so the dialectic itself, which is an affirmation of the way that Plato and Socrates are thinking of our reasoning as something that is intricately linked with correction and likewise problems of contradiction, and also advancement in thought, otherwise known as our ethical connection with how it is that we're rational. Because for Plato and Socrates, to aim to be better rational people, we are also doing so in an ethical way. In other words, to reason is also a way in which we are good. And so we also are looking at now, more specifically, the great rationalist, otherwise known as René Descartes. And so Descartes was born in 1596 and dies in 1650. So he was living in the more or less in the 17th century. And he also is said to signify the modern period in philosophy, but also the scientific revolution as well, because we are also seeing that Descartes was a scientist and a philosopher at the same time. And so this is quite common to see not only in ancient Greece, but also in the 16th and 17th century Europe, that oftentimes philosophers were also scientists. And so the scientific revolution was a time of questioning of religious authority, and likewise a way in which we're establishing the foundation for scientific investigation. And we still shouldn't forget that Descartes had strong religious ties, and justifications for his type of rationalism are linked to the way in which he believed in God, and likewise justified the existence of God, and simultaneously justified the presence of our rational cognition by way of God as well, which is connected to what's often called his ontological argument. Yet at the same time, and ontology there really means how it is that we're understanding the being of God. The origin of God is likewise the way in which we're understanding the ontology of God. But we're not going to talk about that now. We are going to look at how it is that we're understanding the foundation of reason by way of Descartes through his skeptical philosophy. And so he identified that we are very good, or at least were very good at the time, to understand the way in which we're looking at and studying mathematics to further our knowledge of the world. And so he referred to the way in which we reason as the long chains of simple and easy reasonings that he examined to establish and connect to the way in which we know about things and the world. And so, in other words, the lines of mathematical reasoning might serve as a foundation for the way in which we know of things in general, is what he thought. In other words, he felt that the way in which we're understanding things mathematically is necessary, and when we have this foundation of necessity, could there be also a way of grounding how it is that we understand something rationally? In other words, he was reverse engineering our understanding of the necessity that we bring to our study of mathematics. And so we could see his working through of this as foundational. In other words, mathematics contains things like foundational beliefs and unshakable truths, which is what is leading Descartes to think of his skeptical methodology of doubt. In other words, otherwise known as Cartesian skepticism. So in other words, when we're thinking of something skeptically, we're doubting how it is that it's understood or what it is that we're considering. And so he believed that the way to get to this foundation of reasoning or mathematical reasoning was to deploy rigorous skepticism about the world and the way in which we understand it. And that's why it's called Cartesian skepticism or Cartesian doubt. So in the excerpt from Descartes' Discourse on Method from 1637, we are rightly conducting one's reason and seeking of the truth in the sciences for Descartes. And so we find the lead to his method of skepticism, whereby to establish the senses and the perceptions as unreliable and hence doubtful. In other words, we can't rely on perceptions because our perceptions trick us, whereas what we're looking for is the foundation for our reasoning. And this doubt of the perception, this doubt of our perceptual capacity leads us to be doubtful of empirical knowledge or sensory knowledge for Descartes. And so we are still at the very most led to affirm that even if I am doubtful of sense perception, then we are still certain of the fact that I exist, therefore I am. In other words, I think, therefore I am is otherwise known as the cogito, or in Latin the phrase is cogito ergo sum. And this is, as Velasquez writes, thus the doubting self for Descartes is a self in whose existence cannot be doubted. A self not only doubts, but also affirms, wills, and imagines. In a word, the thinking self exists. So if we're understanding the phrase, I think, therefore I am, we're also seeing that the implication is that if I'm existing, then I must be thinking, and likewise, if I'm thinking, I must be existing. And these days, there's some slight problems with that in terms of medical technology. In other words, we could have people that are in a vegetative state who are existing, but not necessarily thinking. But at this time in history, we didn't have such cases, so it was obvious for Descartes that the foundation of reasoning is based in the cogito ergo sum, or in short, the cogito. So for Descartes, the statement, I think, therefore I am, is inherently and foundationally rational, and it's understood by a process of eliminating all doubt of perception, and it is a rational certainty that if I am thinking, I must exist, and if I exist, I must be thinking. So for Descartes, this certainty is affirmed also by God. So for Descartes, God's goodness affirms the clear certainty. And likewise, in the text, we also look at what's known as the wax example. The wax example for Descartes has to do with this idea that we perceive all the different forms of the wax. In other words, we perceive the candle, we also perceive wax in terms of a liquid turning to a solid. It is also identified in terms of beeswax. And so these processes of identification also have to do with how it is that we are reasoning. So not only are we thinking of reasoning as structural and logical in terms of our thinking, we're also seeing reasoning as a way in which we identify things as well. So in other words, identity is an element in the way in which we have knowledge of the world that is inextricably linked to our cognition, our reasoning capacity. And so even the thought process of identification then is seen as a rational activity. And this is a fantastic point to end, and we'll talk about this more in class, and we'll take it from there. So thank you, and talk to you later.